Hello, you now. Welcome to the first Meanwhile Elsewhere homework designed to give you a break from, the monotony of doing the quizzes every other week. This is designed to, give you something else to have a look at, research in your own time. It's a topic that's important to the big key question that we're looking at in class, but we don't really have time to look at. So that big key question in class that we're looking at the moment is the lived experiences of people who went through World War II, their personal experiences. Therefore, it's quite source heavy. So what we're going to be doing with this session is having a look at Burma, which in the 21st century is known as Myanmar. It lies between India and China and Southeast Asia, and it's a region that used to belong to the British Empire. Now, if you have a look at that map on your Meanwhile Elsewhere sheet, you see a big pink blob, and it's just described as the Indian Empire. Now, you might think Indian Empire, what's the association there? Now, the Indian Empire was a massive part of the British Empire at this point in time. Therefore, when Nazi Germany's ally, Japan, mobilised and entered the Second World War, it naturally targeted India and therefore Burma, which meant World War II was not just in Europe, like we mostly learn about in class, but it was in other parts of the world, like Asia too. Now, before we delve into the Burma conflict in World War II, I just want you to understand how we're going to be researching this. Now, if you look at your sheet, you'll notice it's broken down into 4 tasks. The first task is primarily knowledge recall, key takeaways about the Burma conflict, and that's what I'll go through in the first section of the video. I'll provide you with some information and you'll answer the questions in the first task. After that, you have 2 tasks that are source based. You get given 4 different sources, a couple from soldiers who went through the war, some from museums. You'll be asked to match them to certain categories that they're talking about. And then in the third task, you'll be asked to say what do the sources actually tell us about the Burma campaign. Finally, we'll have a 4th task, which is more about individual stories and what some key individuals tell us about the Burma campaign in World War II. Why is Burma so important though in the Second World War? Why is it significant? Why is it worth looking at? Now, the first reason, if you look at that map that you have on your Meanwhile Elsewhere sheets, you'll be able to see that Burma is located in an incredibly strategic location. It's almost like a buffer zone protecting the resource-rich Indian Empire, the Indian section of the British Empire, from the Axis forces, the Japanese forces. And this means that Britain can continue to make money whilst fighting the war, pay for goods, pay for weapons, pay for food from other parts of the world, which it might not be able to if the Indian Empire was under siege from the Japanese forces. As well as this, Burma is home to something called the Burma Road, which I will draw on the map now. Now, it's quite vague. You might be able to just see it there in the top half of Burma. I've done it in a red line. Now, there's the Burma Road, which connects India to China. Whilst all this was going on, China was also on the Allied side in World War II, and they were fighting a bit of conflict against the Japanese Empire. And they received a lot of their resources from the British base in India. And if Britain could protect Burma successfully, that would mean the Chinese could continue to get supplies from India. Another reason is Burma itself is incredibly resource rich. You'll see on the right hand side, you've got some photos from just before World War II. The top right is of a Burmese oil field, huge oil exporter, which means it's hugely beneficial for the British Empire. And oil is a hugely significant resource when a country is at war. You use it in any of your tanks, your cars, your planes, and you want to use it back in Britain to keep the country running. Secondly, another major resource, the mines. Burma has a vast quantity of mineral mines, all sorts of different metals, which are obviously hugely significant when fighting a war. But because Britain was involved in theatres all over the world, North Africa, Western Europe, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean. This meant a lot of their homegrown soldiers, English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, were in those theatres, and this meant that Britain was struggling to find the manpower to defend Burma. And this would mean it would end up recruiting and sending soldiers from parts of Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, all the other parts of the empire, and sending them over to Burma into what was going to be a horrific set of circumstances. The Japanese had just recently had victory after victory after victory in that area. They were very confident. They had been fighting in the jungle for a long time because they had campaigns in Southeast Asia for a long time. And not to mention, the jungle itself has some pretty horrific circumstances, like weather, like the heat, like the humidity, like water hazards, natural sort of disasters that can go wrong. Native groups who weren't particularly happy to see British soldiers there. All these different problems meant that these men were being sent from all over the world into a set of circumstances they didn't particularly understand. What's quite sad is a lot of historians think these young men don't really get given a lot of credit because a lot of them weren't from Britain, and they've become known as the Forgotten Army because in Britain no one really ever learns about them. Speaking of that jungle warfare, Burma geographically is a heavily forested, quite sort of river-crossed country. A lot of flooding in the wet season, monsoons, extreme weather, incredibly dry heat where the soldiers were having to lug their backpacks along hilly mountainous terrain for days and days on end, cross rivers that were far wider in reality than they were on maps due to flooding, and having to utilise creatures like elephants to help them cross rivers, build roads, because tanks and more modern vehicles just couldn't deal with the terrain. So now we went through all that, try and take a moment to answer those 4 questions in task 1. If it's worthwhile, pause me now or rewind through the video, go back through that information if it helps. But if you're done, we can just carry on. Now task 2 is a little bit different. What I'd like you to do is have a look at those 4 sources I've retrieved on the PowerPoint. We've got source A, which is Neville Horgan. He's a British soldier, or he was a British soldier. Source B, which is from the US Army Museum. Yes, it wasn't just British soldiers that fought in Burma, eventually American soldiers would join them there. You have source C, which is a quote from Dominic Neal, a British soldier, well, an extract from a letter. And source D is from the Imperial War Museum, which is based in the UK. What you're going to do is you're going to read through the excerpts, and then you're going to try and match them to the correct category. What does that source tell us about? Does it tell us about brutality? Does it tell us about personal experiences? Or does it tell us about how global the Second World War was? The first source has already been done for you. Neville Horgan. Now I'll just read through it. He said, I think parties of about 30 or 40 were organised to swim this river. It's frightening. Boots around my neck. About halfway, I had a foot in my thigh. It turned out I was hit by shrapnel in my thigh. Out of our party of about 30 or 40, there must have been about only 10 of us left. Now, Neville Horgan's clearly mixes scenes of brutality, but it's also his personal experience. So source A can go into those 2 categories. Now, pause me and go through those 3 other sources, matching them to the correct category. Penultimately, you have a task to use those sources to draw out what you can actually tell about the Burma campaign. So, having looked at those 4 sources, can you now in your own words, the sentence starts there to help, but can you in your own words explain what they tell us about the Burma campaign in the Second World War? Now finally, as I always say in the classroom, history isn't anything without the individual stories. These stories are woven together, and that's what makes history. So part of the Burma campaign was a special forces group known as the Chindit. They have an incredibly fascinating story, and they tell us a lot about the Burma campaign. They tell us a lot about the difficulties of the Burma campaign, and they'll help us in class regarding that big question about personal experiences during the Second World War. So can you now read through this, pausing me so you can read through it, read through the story of the Chindit and answer who were they or what were they, and answer what they tell us about the Second World War. When you've done that, thank you for completing the Meanwhile Elsewhere homework.